Good evening and welcome back. The first George locked his wife in a castle for 32 years. The second watched his queen die of a hernia she had hidden beneath her corsets because she could not afford to stop working. The third lost America, lost his mind, and spent the last decade of his life blind and deaf in a room at Windsor, talking to people who had been dead for 30 years. The fourth was so fat when he died that his coffin had to be specially built, and the Times wrote that there had never been an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures. 4 kings, one name, 116 years. And the country they governed transformed, not because of its kings, but despite them, from a second-rate European power into the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Tonight we are going to meet all 4 of them. We are going to follow the House of Hanover from a coach arriving at Greenwich in 1714 to a specially widened coffin leaving Windsor Castle in 1830. The coach carried a German prince who had never visited England and who did not particularly want to. The coffin carried a man who had spent his life consuming everything his country could provide and who left behind nothing but debts and a building in Brighton that looked like a fever dream. Between the coach and the coffin, everything changed. The monarchy, the empire, the meaning of kingship itself, and none of the 4 men named George understood what was happening around them until it was too late. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to drift into sleep or to spend the evening with the kings who gave their name to an era, I am glad you are with me. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Now, let us begin with a ship crossing the Channel in the late summer of 1714. The ship carried a man who did not want to be where he was going. George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, was 54 years old, and he was crossing the English Channel because the law of England required it. Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, had died on the 1st of August 1714 without a surviving child. Her 17 pregnancies had produced 5 live births and 12 miscarriages, and of the 5 children born alive, none had survived to adulthood. The throne was empty. The succession was in crisis. And the solution that Parliament had devised years earlier in a piece of legislation called the Act of Settlement was about to produce one of the strangest transfers of power in European history. The Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in English history, and it was born from fear. The fear was Catholic restoration. The memory of James II was only 26 years old. James had tried to re-Catholicize England in the 1680s and had been driven from his throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The memory was still raw. The political class that had expelled James was determined that no Catholic would sit on the English throne again, and the determination was written into law with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. The Act specified that the Crown of England would pass only to Protestant heirs. This was the crucial word, Protestant. The Act was designed to prevent the return of a Catholic monarch, and the prevention required the exclusion of every Catholic with a claim to the throne, regardless of how strong that claim might be. When the exclusions were counted, 57 people with closer blood ties to the crown than George Ludwig were passed over. 57. Some of them were members of the Stuart family itself. Some were princes and princesses of major European houses. All of them were Catholic, and their Catholicism disqualified them as absolutely as if they had been born on the moon. George Ludwig was the nearest Protestant. His mother, Sophia of Hanover, had been the granddaughter of James I of England, and that connection, thin as a thread and stretched across a century, was enough. Sophia herself had been designated the heir, but she died 2 months before Queen Anne, collapsing in the gardens of Herrenhausen Palace during an evening walk. The crown that should have been hers passed to her son, and her son accepted it with the particular reluctance of a man who is being offered something valuable in exchange for something he values more. What George valued was Hanover. He was the Elector of Hanover, one of the most important principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. Hanover was a prosperous, well-managed state in northern Germany, smaller than England, but not insignificant. The capital city was elegant, with wide streets and baroque buildings and a palace that George had spent years improving. The gardens at Herrenhausen, designed in the formal European style, were among the finest in Germany. The court was cultured. The army was professional. The administration was efficient. George had built all of this. He had spent 30 years turning Hanover into a model of enlightened German governance, and now he was being asked to leave it, to cross the sea, to govern a country he did not know, in a language he did not speak, for a people he had never met. England was a foreign country that happened to need a king, and the king it needed happened to be him, and the coincidence did not fill him with joy. He arrived at Greenwich on the 18th of September 1714. The Thames was crowded with boats. Every vessel on the river, from the barges of the city companies to the wherries of the watermen, had come out to see the new king arrive. The steps at Greenwich were lined with officials in their robes, the Lord Mayor, the aldermen, the members of the Privy Council who had governed the country during the interregnum between Anne's death and George's arrival. The cannons fired from the tower. The bells rang from every church in the city, a cascade of sound that rolled westward along the river, and that the new king could hear from the deck of his ship as it rounded the bend at Deptford. The city that George was arriving to govern was, in 1714, the largest in Europe. Perhaps 600,000 people lived within the sprawl of streets and lanes and alleys that stretched from the Tower in the east to Westminster in the west. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse dung, and the particular damp sourness of the Thames at low tide. The mudflats were exposed. The smell of the river was the smell of a city that used its waterway as a sewer and a highway, and a source of drinking water all at once. The streets were narrow. The traffic was constant. Coaches, sedan chairs, carts, horsemen, pedestrians, all of them competing for space on roads that had been designed for a smaller city and that were inadequate for the city London had become. The noise was considerable. The danger was real. People were killed by coaches every week. The iron-rimmed wheels did not stop for pedestrians who could not move fast enough. People were robbed in the streets every night. The footpads worked in pairs, one blocking the way while the other searched the pockets. The watchmen who patrolled the streets were few, poorly paid, and often old men who carried a lantern and a staff, and who posed no serious threat to criminals who carried knives. London in 1714 was magnificent and filthy and dangerous and alive in a way that Hanover, with its orderly streets and its manageable population, was not. The landing was elaborate. The barges were decorated. The guns fired. Salutes. The crowd that gathered on the riverbank stared at the man who was about to become their sovereign and saw a figure who was neither impressive nor inspiring. He was of medium height. He was heavy. His face was long and his expression was guarded. He wore German clothes. He spoke to his attendants in German. He looked, to the English observers who recorded the moment, like a man visiting a country he expected to dislike. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge the cheers. He stepped from the barge onto the steps at Greenwich with the heavy deliberation of a man performing a duty, not fulfilling a dream. The officials who greeted him noted his expression, his bearing, his manner. They noted the German attendants who surrounded him, the German voices, the German faces that filled the space between the new king and his new subjects. The landing was a public event. The public watched a man who did not want to be watched, and the watching was the beginning of a relationship that would never warm into affection. And England, looking back at him, was not sure what to make of what it saw. The English had been told to expect a king. What they got was a middle-aged German who showed no interest in their language, their food, their customs, or their opinions. He did not make speeches. He did not court popularity. He did not wave to the crowds or visit the churches or do any of the things that English monarchs were expected to do to demonstrate their connection with their subjects. He went to St. James's Palace. He closed the door. He ate his German dinner at his German hour. And the country that had invited him to be its king began to wonder whether the invitation had been a mistake. He brought 2 mistresses with him. This was not, in itself, unusual. Kings had mistresses. The English were accustomed to royal mistresses. but George's mistresses were notable for their appearance. Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg was tall, thin, and angular. Charlotte Sophia Kielmansegge was short, round, and enormous. The English, who had a gift for unkind nicknames, immediately called them the Maypole and the Elephant. The nicknames stuck. They would follow the two women through the entire reign. The Maypole and the Elephant became fixtures of the English satirical landscape, drawn in caricatures, mocked in pamphlets, discussed in coffee houses with the cheerful cruelty that the English brought to the discussion of foreign women they considered beneath them. The fact that both women were intelligent, that Melusine in particular was a shrewd political operator who influenced the king's decisions on matters of patronage and appointment, was irrelevant. They were German. They were the king's mistresses. They looked funny. That was enough. Melusine von der Schulenburg was eventually created Duchess of Kendal by George, a title that gave her a place in the English peerage and that scandalized the English aristocracy, who objected to sharing their ranks with a German mistress. Kielmansegge was created Countess of Darlington. Both women profited from their positions. Both sold access to the king. Both accepted gifts and payments from people who wanted the king's favor. The corruption was open, and it was tolerated because the alternative, a king who paid attention to English politics and who interfered in English government, was considered worse than a king whose mistresses could be bribed. He did not bring his wife. This was unusual. This required explanation. And the explanation, when it emerged, was the first of the dark stories that would shadow the House of Hanover for a century. Sophia Dorothea of Celle had married George Ludwig in 1682 when she was 16 and he was 22. The marriage was arranged for political reasons. The union of Hanover and Celle would consolidate the family's power in northern Germany. The bride's preferences were not consulted. They rarely were. The marriage was unhappy from the beginning. George was stolid, military-minded, and emotionally unavailable. Sophia Dorothea was vivacious, romantic, and desperate for the kind of attention that her husband was constitutionally unable to provide. He kept mistresses openly. She resented the mistresses openly. The resentment and the infidelity fed each other in the way that resentment and infidelity always do, each one making the other worse, until the marriage was a closed system of grievance that neither party could escape. In 1689, Sophia Dorothea began an affair with Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman serving at the Hanoverian court. The affair lasted 5 years. The letters they exchanged are among the most passionate documents in European royal history. They wrote in French, the language of love and diplomacy, and the language concealed nothing. They wrote about desire. They wrote about loneliness. They wrote about the particular desperation of two people trapped in a world that denied them the one thing they wanted, which was each other. The letters were smuggled between them by servants who were paid for their discretion, and who were, inevitably, discovered by servants who were paid more for their indiscretion. The letters they exchanged, hundreds of them, were passionate, reckless, and eventually intercepted. In July 1694, Königsmarck disappeared. He was never seen again. The most widely accepted account is that he was murdered on the orders of George Ludwig's father, Ernst August, who considered the affair an intolerable threat to the family's reputation. Some accounts say Königsmarck was killed in the corridors of the palace and his body dissolved in quicklime. Others say he was buried beneath the floorboards of a room in the Lane Palace. The truth has never been established with certainty. What is certain is that Königsmarck vanished, and the vanishing was permanent. Sophia Dorothea was arrested. She was tried before a consistory court for deserting her husband. The verdict was foregone. The marriage was dissolved. She was stripped of her titles. Her children, George Augustus and Sophia Dorothea the younger, were taken from her. George Augustus was 11. He was old enough to understand what was happening and too young to prevent it. His mother was taken away. His father offered no explanation. The household closed around the absence as though the mother had never existed. The servants were instructed not to speak of her. The portraits were removed. The name was not mentioned. George Augustus grew up with a hole in his family that no one acknowledged, and that shaped his character in ways that would not become fully visible for decades. His sister, Sophia Dorothea, married the King of Prussia and became the mother of Frederick the Great. She never saw her mother again either. The two children of the imprisoned princess went on to produce some of the most powerful rulers in European history, and the woman who bore them spent those years in a castle in the German countryside, watching the seasons change through the same windows, walking the same garden paths, growing old in a silence that the dynasty she had married into enforced with the thoroughness of a state secret. She was sent to the castle of Ahlden, a small manor house in a remote part of northern Germany, and she was told that she would remain there for the rest of her life. She did. 32 years. The castle at Ahlden was comfortable in the way that a well-furnished prison is comfortable. She had servants. She had a coach, though she was not permitted to travel beyond the boundaries of the estate. She had books. She had correspondence, though her letters were monitored, and her incoming mail was censored by officials appointed by her ex-husband. She had a small garden where she walked in the afternoons, the same paths, the same views, the same walls at the edges of her world. She did not go mad. This deserves noting because 32 years of confinement might reasonably be expected to break a person. Sophia Dorothea did not break. She endured, she maintained her dignity, she kept her household in order. She wrote letters that were intercepted and prayers that were not. She aged in a room that did not change, while outside the walls of Ahlden, the world her husband governed grew larger and more powerful, and forgot her entirely. From 1694 to 1726, Sophia Dorothea lived at Ahlden, confined to the house and its grounds, forbidden to remarry, forbidden to see her children, forbidden to use the title of Queen when her husband became King of England. She wrote letters to her children that were intercepted and never delivered. She requested permission to visit them that was denied without explanation. She grew old in a house that was comfortable, but that was in every sense that mattered, a prison. She died on the 13th of November 1726 at the age of 60. Her son, George Augustus, who was by then the Prince of Wales and who had not seen his mother since he was 11 years old, was not permitted to attend the funeral. Her ex-husband, George I, King of England, received the news of her death and said nothing. He died himself 7 months later, and the woman who might have been Queen of England was buried quietly at Celle, in a vault that most English people would never hear of. Her story folded into the larger story of the dynasty that had imprisoned her, a dynasty that had prospered in part because she was not there to complicate it. George I governed England the way a man manages a property he has inherited in a country he does not live in. He visited, he inspected, he approved or disapproved the work of the people he had placed in charge. And then he went home, which for George meant Hanover. He returned to Hanover almost every summer, travelling by coach across the Netherlands and into Germany, retracing the route he had taken in the opposite direction when he first came to claim the English crown. The journeys took weeks. The absences lasted months. England, during these absences, was governed by a regent and a council of ministers. The ministers were competent. They understood English politics far better than the king did. They ran the country with an efficiency that the king's presence could not have improved. This was the accidental genius of George I's reign. His indifference to English affairs created a vacuum that the English political class filled with the system of cabinet government that would become the foundation of British democracy. The king did not attend cabinet meetings because he could not follow the discussion. He could not follow the discussion because his English was poor, and because the ministers spoke too quickly and used idioms he did not understand. The ministers, freed from the obligation to report to a king who was not in the room, developed the habit of making decisions among themselves. The most senior minister, the one who coordinated the decisions and reported them to the king, became, in practice, if not yet in title, the Prime Minister. The system that emerged was, in retrospect, one of the most important political innovations in European history. The king could not govern because he could not communicate with his ministers. The ministers could not wait for the king because the business of government could not wait. The solution was for the ministers to govern themselves, reporting to the king through a single intermediary who summarized the decisions that had already been made and presented them for royal approval that was, in practice, automatic. Robert Walpole is usually identified as the first British Prime Minister, though the title was not formalized during his tenure. He served from 1721 to 1742, managing the government with a combination of political skill, financial acumen, and personal corruption that would become the template for British politics for the next century. Walpole bought votes. He distributed patronage. He rewarded loyalty with offices and punished disloyalty with exclusion. He built a political machine that operated on the principle that every man had his price, and that the business of government was to discover what that price was and to pay it. The system was cynical. It was effective. It kept Britain stable and prosperous for 20 years, which is more than most systems can claim. Walpole understood George I better than any other English politician did, and the understanding was practical rather than personal. George wanted three things. He wanted to be left alone. He wanted Hanover to be protected. He wanted his income to be secure. Walpole provided all three. He managed the government so that the king did not need to interfere. He ensured that British foreign policy did not threaten Hanoverian interests. He maintained the civil list, the king's personal income from Parliament, at a level that satisfied George's requirements without provoking parliamentary resistance. He managed George I by keeping the king informed through brief written reports that told the king what he needed to know and omitted what he did not. He managed George II, who succeeded in 1727 by cultivating Queen Caroline, who managed the king. The court that George I maintained in London was a German court transplanted onto English soil. The food was German. Heavy meat dishes, sauerkraut, the dense, dark bread of northern Germany. The English courtiers, accustomed to French-influenced cooking and lighter fare, found the meals difficult. The conversation was German. The entertainment was German. The king's closest advisors were German. The atmosphere of St. James's Palace during George I's reign had the quality of a diplomatic outpost rather than a royal residence. The English courtiers stood on one side of the room. The German advisors stood on the other. The king, who belonged to both sides and was fully comfortable with neither, moved between them with the heavy tread of a man who had accepted a responsibility he had never wanted. He ate his dinner at 2 p.m, the German hour, while the English court ate at 4. He retired to his private apartments in the early evening, to the rooms where his German attendants waited. The conversation there was in German. The card games were German. The atmosphere was, for a few hours each day, the atmosphere of Hanover transplanted into the draughty rooms of a London palace. He wrote letters to Hanover in his own hand, long, detailed letters about the management of the electorate, the letters of a man whose real work was elsewhere, and whose attention was always, in some fundamental way, directed homeward. He was not a bad king. This deserves saying because the caricature of George I as a boorish German who stumbled onto the English throne and did nothing with it is unfair. He was a competent administrator. He was an experienced military commander. He had governed Hanover effectively for decades. He understood statecraft. He understood diplomacy. He understood the balance of power in Europe, which was, in the early 18th century, the most important strategic question facing any European monarch. What he did not understand was England, and care about was becoming English. He governed from a distance, emotionally as well as geographically. The relationship between George I and England was a marriage of convenience in which neither party pretended to be in love. George needed England because England gave him status. An elector of Hanover was a German prince among German princes. A king of England was a European sovereign of the first rank. The promotion mattered, the prestige mattered, the income mattered. England was richer than Hanover by a factor of 10, and the revenues of the English crown funded George's ambitions in Germany in ways that Hanover's revenues alone could never have done. England needed George because the alternative was worse. The country tolerated him because the alternative was a Catholic Stuart, and the country's tolerance of George was, in the end, a tolerance of the lesser evil rather than an embrace of the greater good. The Jacobites were the constant shadow. They were the supporters of the exiled Stuart dynasty, the men and women who believed that James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of the deposed James II, was the rightful king of England, and that the Hanoverian succession was a usurpation. They were concentrated in Scotland and Ireland, where Catholic loyalty to the Stuarts ran deep, but they had supporters in England too. In the Tory party, in the Catholic gentry, in the romantic corners of English society where loyalty to a fallen dynasty was considered more honourable than compliance with a successful one. The first Jacobite rising came in 1715, barely a year after George I's arrival. The Earl of Mar raised the Stuart standard at Braemar in September. Within weeks he had assembled an army of 10,000 men, mostly Highland Scots, mostly Catholic, mostly willing to fight and die for a king they had never met, and who was, at that moment, somewhere in France trying to arrange a ship. The rising failed. It failed not because the Jacobite army was defeated in the field, but because the Jacobite leadership was incompetent. Mar was an indecisive general who won a battle at Sheriff Muir in November, but failed to follow up the victory. James himself, the Old Pretender, did not arrive in Scotland until December, by which time the momentum had been lost, the winter had set in, and the government forces had regrouped. James stayed for 6 weeks. He held a sombre court at Scone. He made a poor impression on the Highlanders, who had risked everything for him, appearing cold, distant, and depressed, which he was. He left in February 1716, taking a ship from Montrose, and he never returned to Britain. George I's throne survived because the alternative was not compelling enough to inspire the sustained effort that a successful rebellion required. The Stuart cause had romance on its side, but not logistics. It had loyalty, but not leadership. It had the Highlands, but not the Lowlands. And without the Lowlands, it could not hold Scotland. And without Scotland, it could not threaten England. The prisoners taken after the rising were treated with a severity that reflected the government's fear. Several lords who had joined the rebellion were tried for treason. The Earl of Derwentwater and Viscount Kenmure were executed on Tower Hill in February 1716. Others were imprisoned. Others escaped abroad and joined the Stuart court in exile, adding their names to the growing community of Jacobite refugees who lived in France and Italy and dreamed of return. The rising of 1715 was a rehearsal. The full performance would come 30 years later, under a different George and a different Stuart, and it would come closer to success than anyone in 1715 could have imagined. George I died on the 11th of June 1727 in his coach on the road to Osnabrück on one of his regular summer journeys to Hanover. He had suffered a stroke. The symptoms came on suddenly. His face changed, his speech slurred. The attendants in the coach realized what was happening and called for the driver to stop. The coach stopped on the road, in the German countryside, miles from anywhere, the King of England dying in a carriage on a road that led away from England and toward the country he had always considered home. The attendants carried him into a nearby house. He died that evening. He was 67 years old. He had been King of England for 13 years, and he had spent approximately half of that time in Germany. His body was taken back to Hanover for burial. He was interred in the chapel at Herrenhausen, in the country he had loved, in the palace he had built among the gardens where his mother had walked. England did not mourn him greatly. He had not given the country enough of himself to inspire mourning. He had given it something more useful. He had given it a system of government that did not depend on the king's presence, and the system was, in the end, more valuable than the king. His son hated him. This is the first thing to understand about George II, because the hatred shaped everything that followed. George Augustus had not spoken to his father in years. He had been running a rival court at Leicester House, a deliberate counter-establishment where everyone who opposed the king was welcome. The conversation was conducted in English pointedly, as a rebuke to the German atmosphere of St. James's. The hatred had roots. George Augustus had been 11 years old when his mother was imprisoned at Ahlden. He had been forbidden to see her. He had been raised by his father and his father's mistresses, and he had grown up knowing that his mother was alive, that she was alone, that she was 40 miles away, and that his father would not allow him to visit her. The knowledge had hardened into a resentment that nothing could soften, and that George I's indifference to his son's feelings only deepened. When the news of his father's death reached Leicester House, George Augustus did not mourn. He accepted the crown with a briskness that suggested he had been waiting for it impatiently, which he had. He was 43 years old. He was short, vain, hot-tempered, and obsessed with military matters, to a degree that his courtiers found exhausting. He collected tin soldiers. He arranged them in battle formations on tables, recreating famous engagements from the War of the Spanish Succession and the campaigns of Marlborough. He could describe the tactical disposition of the Allied forces at Blenheim from memory. He could explain why Ramillies was a masterpiece of manoeuvre. He could list the casualties at Malplaquet with the precision of a man who considered battle losses a branch of mathematics. He was also vain about his appearance, fussy about his clothes, and prone to rages that his courtiers found terrifying and that his wife found manageable. He shouted. He threw things. He kicked his wig across the room when he was angry, which was often. The rages passed as quickly as they came, leaving the king exhausted and slightly embarrassed, and the courtiers shaken and the wig on the floor. Despite the rages, he was not cruel. He was impatient, which is different. He expected competence. He expected punctuality. He expected the people around him to know what they were doing, and to do it without being told twice. When they failed to meet these expectations, he shouted. When they met them, he was generous and surprisingly warm. The key was not to bore him. Boredom was the one sin George II could not forgive. He was, in almost every respect, the opposite of his father, which was the point. But he had one advantage that his father had lacked. He had Caroline. Caroline of Ansbach was the most important person in the reign of George II, and she was not the king, she was the queen. She was German by birth, educated, well-read, intellectually curious, in a way that her husband was not. She possessed a political intelligence so acute that the men who encountered it often failed to recognize what was happening to them. The conversation would end and the decision would be made, and they would not realize until later that the decision had been hers. Caroline was one of the most intellectually accomplished women in Europe. She had been raised at the court of the Electress Sophia of Hanover, George I's mother, who had been a friend and correspondent of the philosopher Leibniz. Caroline had met Leibniz as a young woman. She had discussed philosophy with him. Not as a student discusses philosophy with a teacher, but as an equal. Leibniz treated her as an intellectual companion, which she was. Their correspondence continued after Caroline left the Hanoverian court, and the letters they exchanged are among the few documents that show a royal woman of the 18th century engaging with ideas at the highest level. She had read his work and understood it, which was more than most professional philosophers could claim. She carried the habit of intellectual engagement into her marriage and into the English court, where she established a circle of writers, thinkers, and scientists that included Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and the theologian Samuel Clarke. She married George Augustus in 1705, when he was still the Electoral Prince of Hanover. The marriage was, by the standards of royal marriages, genuinely affectionate. George loved Caroline. He also kept mistresses, which Caroline tolerated with the particular grace of a woman who understood that her husband's infidelities were a matter of vanity rather than of feeling. The mistresses were decorative. Caroline was essential. George knew the difference, even if he could not have articulated it. Her method of managing the king was simple and devastatingly effective. She agreed with him. And then, in private, in the evenings, in the quiet hours after the court had retired, she would gently, gradually, almost imperceptibly shift his position toward the one she actually wanted him to hold. The shift was so subtle that George rarely noticed it was happening. She would begin by praising his position. What a wise observation. How clearly you see the matter. Then she would introduce a small modification. Of course, one might also consider. The modification would be presented not as a correction, but as an extension of his own thinking, a logical development of the brilliant insight he had already provided. By the end of the conversation, the king would hold a position that was Caroline's, believe it was his, and defend it with the passion of a man protecting his own idea. Lord Hervey, who observed the court closely and recorded his observations with a malice that makes his memoirs invaluable, described the process with precision. The Queen managed the king, Hervey wrote, as a jockey manages a horse, by knowing when to use the spur and sugar. He would arrive at a new opinion and believe it was his own. Caroline would express surprise and admiration at his insight. The ministers, who understood exactly what was happening, said nothing. Robert Walpole, who had managed George I through written reports, managed George II through Caroline. The alliance between the Prime Minister and the Queen was the engine that drove British government for 15 years. Walpole brought the political intelligence. Caroline brought the access. Between them they kept the king pointed in the right direction and kept the country stable during a period when stability was neither guaranteed nor inevitable. The arrangement required Caroline to perform a role that was exhausting and that offered no public credit. She could not be seen to influence the king. The fiction that the king made his own decisions had to be maintained, because a king who was known to be managed by his wife was a king who had lost the respect of his court. Caroline maintained the fiction with a discipline that cost her health and eventually her life. She worked constantly, she ate little, she slept badly. She carried the weight of the government on her shoulders while appearing to carry nothing at all. Caroline died on the 20th of November 1737, and her death revealed with brutal clarity the price she had paid for the role she had played. She had been suffering from a hernia for years, an umbilical hernia that protruded from her abdomen. She had concealed it beneath her corsets and her gowns, because the revelation would have required her to withdraw from public life. Withdrawal was something she could not afford. The hernia worsened. It became strangulated. The tissue began to die. By the time the surgeons were called, the damage was catastrophic. The surgery was performed without anesthesia in her bedchamber at St. James's Palace, while the king paced in the room next door. The surgeons opened the abdomen. They found gangrene. They did what they could, which was not much. Caroline endured the procedure with a composure that the surgeons found extraordinary, and that was in truth the final performance of a life spent performing. She knew she was dying. She told the king to remarry. The king, weeping, said he would not. He would have mistresses, he said, but he would not remarry. The distinction was the most honest thing he ever said about his marriage. She died 10 days after the surgery. George was inconsolable. The man who had kept mistresses throughout their marriage, who had flaunted his infidelities, collapsed into a grief so complete that the court did not know how to manage him. He refused to remarry, as he had promised. He kept her rooms untouched. He ordered that when he died, the sides of their coffins should be removed so that their remains could mingle in death as they had not always mingled in life. The instruction was followed. The instruction was carried out when George died 23 years later. The coffins were placed side by side in the vault beneath the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, and the sides were removed as the king had requested. They lie together at Westminster Abbey, the joined coffins, a monument to a marriage that was more complicated and more genuine than either of them could have expressed while they were alive. Without Caroline, George II was diminished but not destroyed. He had his military obsession, and the military obsession sustained him. He was the last British monarch to lead troops in battle, and the battle in which he led them, Dettingen, fought on the 27th of June 1743, is one of the strangest episodes in the history of the British Crown. The War of the Austrian Succession had drawn Britain into a continental conflict. George, who was in Hanover at the time, took personal command of the Allied army. a combined force of British, Hanoverian, and Austrian troops, and marched them into Bavaria to confront the French. The army was large, perhaps 40,000 men, and the king was at its head, riding a white horse, wearing his military uniform, carrying a sword he fully intended to use. The battle was chaotic. The French attacked before the Allied army was properly deployed. The king's horse, frightened by the gunfire, bolted. George was thrown from the saddle or dismounted deliberately. The accounts vary, and found himself on foot in the middle of a battle, a 60-year-old man with a sword in his hand and the French cavalry bearing down on him. He did not run. He stood his ground. The mud was thick. The noise was extraordinary. The particular roar of an 18th century battlefield, musket fire and cannon fire, and the shouting of men and the screaming of horses. The king was in the middle of it. He was wearing his sword. He was visible, unmistakable, a target that the French marksmen could not have missed if they had tried. He did not move. He rallied the troops around him. He shouted orders. He pointed with his sword. He fought, or at least he stood where the fighting was, which in the 18th century was considered the same thing. The Allies won. The French retreated across the River Main. And the image of the king standing in the mud, sword drawn, refusing to yield, became the defining image of his reign. It was also the end of something. After Dettingen, no British monarch would ever again command an army in the field. After Dettingen, the king returned to London as a hero. The crowds cheered him through the streets. Handel composed the Dettingen Te Deum to celebrate the victory, a thunderous piece of choral music performed at the Chapel Royal. It announced in brass and voices and the rolling of kettle drums that the King of England had stood in the field and fought and won. The celebration was genuine, the admiration was real, and the role of the sovereign shifted. The king became a symbol rather than a soldier, a figurehead rather than a general. The change was gradual, and it was not formalized, but it was real. And it began on the day that George II dismounted from his bolting horse and discovered that personal courage, however admirable, was no longer what kingship required. The Jacobites came again in 1745. This time the challenge was real. Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, the grandson of the deposed James II, landed on the west coast of Scotland in August with 7 men, a handful of weapons, and a conviction that the Highland clans would rise for him. He was 24 years old. He had been raised in Rome, in the exiled Stuart court, in an atmosphere of perpetual grievance and perpetual hope. His father, the old pretender, had spent a lifetime waiting for a restoration that never came. Charles was determined not to wait. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed of an optimism so extreme that it bordered on delusion. The delusion, for a time, looked like genius. The clans rose. Not all of them, but enough. Within weeks, Charles had an army of several thousand Highland warriors, men who fought with broadsword and targe, who charged downhill with a ferocity that regular troops found terrifying. He took Edinburgh without a fight. The capital of Scotland, the city of the castle and the palace and the ancient parliament, fell to the Jacobites in September 1745 without a shot being fired. Charles entered Holyrood Palace and held court in the rooms where his ancestors had ruled. He wore Highland dress. He danced with the ladies of Edinburgh. He charmed the city with a combination of youth, beauty, and confidence that made it possible, for a few weeks, to believe that the Stuart cause might actually succeed. The court at Holyrood was brief and brilliant. Charles received visitors. He issued proclamations. He planned his campaign with the optimism of a young man who has never lost a battle, which he had not, because he had only fought one, and he had won it. He defeated the government army at Prestonpans in 10 minutes. He marched south into England. The march south was the high water mark of the Jacobite cause. Charles reached Derby, 125 miles from London, by the 5th of December. George II, according to some accounts, had his valuables packed and a yacht ready at the Tower of London. The panic in the capital was real. London, in December 1745, believed that a Highland army was about to appear on the Great North Road and that the city would be taken. The militia was called out. The theatres closed. The shops boarded their windows. Wealthy families packed their valuables and prepared to leave. The roads south were clogged with carriages carrying the possessions of people who intended to be elsewhere when the Highlanders arrived. The Bank of England was in genuine danger. A run on the bank had begun. Depositors were withdrawing their money as fast as the clerks could count it. The bank adopted a strategy of paying out in sixpences, the smallest available denomination, to slow the withdrawals. The clerks counted out sixpence after sixpence, taking as long as possible over each transaction, buying time for the panic to subside. The shops closed. The Bank of England paid out in sixpences to slow the run on its reserves. The city held its breath. And then Charles turned back. His commanders, who were more realistic than their prince, pointed out that the English Jacobites had not risen to support the march. The expected French invasion had not materialized. The government was assembling armies to the north and south. The Highland army, deep in enemy territory, outnumbered and unsupplied, was in danger of being surrounded and destroyed. Charles wanted to press on. His commanders refused. The argument at Derby was the argument that destroyed the cause. Charles wanted to march on London. Lord George Murray, his most capable general, wanted to retreat to Scotland, consolidate, and wait for the French support that had been promised and that had not arrived. The argument was conducted in the drawing room of a house on Full Street, with maps spread on the table and the future of the Stuart dynasty at stake. Murray prevailed. Charles wept. He said that from this moment he considered himself a lost man. The retreat began on the 6th of December, and the retreat was the beginning of the end. Culloden was fought on the 16th of April 1746, on a flat, boggy moor east of Inverness. The Duke of Cumberland, George II's younger son, commanded the government forces. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Jacobite army was tired, hungry, and positioned on ground that Cumberland had chosen specifically because it favoured his artillery and his disciplined infantry. The Highland charge, the terrifying downhill rush of clansmen with broadswords, had broken government lines before. Cumberland had trained his troops to counter it. Each soldier was instructed to bayonet, not the man coming directly at him, but the man to his right, attacking under the raised sword arm where the tarred shield could not protect. The instruction was clinical. The execution was devastating. The Highland charge came at 1 in the afternoon. It was met with grape shot at close range, then musket fire, then bayonets. The clansmen fell in rows. The Highland charge, which had been devastating at Prestonpans, was broken by disciplined musket fire and grape shot. The Jacobite army was destroyed. Between 1,000 and 2,000 men were killed on the field. The wounded were bayoneted where they lay. The pursuit that followed was merciless. Cumberland's troops swept through the Highlands in the weeks after the battle, burning cottages, killing livestock, executing men suspected of Jacobite sympathies. The soldiers called it pacification. The Highlanders called it something else. Women and children were turned out of their homes in April, with no food and no shelter, into a landscape that was still winter cold in the north. The old and the sick died where they fell. The strong survived by hiding in the hills, eating what they could find, waiting for the soldiers to move on. Cumberland earned the nickname Butcher Cumberland, and the nickname was deserved. The aftermath was worse than the battle. The government set about the systematic destruction of the Highland way of life. The clans were disarmed. The wearing of tartan was banned. The Gaelic language was suppressed. The chiefs were stripped of their hereditary jurisdictions. The Highlands, which had been a semi-independent society for centuries, were absorbed into the British state by force. The absorption was accompanied by a programme of cultural destruction that the Highlanders would not forget. Scotland remembers it to this day. Charles Edward Stuart escaped. He spent 5 months as a fugitive in the Highlands, moving from hiding place to hiding place. sheltered by men and women who risked their lives to protect him. He was disguised, famously, as a maidservant named Betty Burke by Flora MacDonald, who rowed him across the sea to Skye in an open boat while government ships patrolled the waters. The reward for his capture was £30,000, a fortune so vast that it could have transformed the life of anyone who claimed it. No one claimed it. The loyalty of the Highlanders to a prince who had led them to destruction and who was now fleeing the consequences was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of personal devotion in British history. It was also, in its way, the last act of the old Highland world that Culloden had destroyed. He was smuggled to France in September 1746. He spent the rest of his life in exile. The decline was slow and ugly. He drank heavily. He became violent. He married Princess Louise of Stolberg-Gedden in 1772, and the marriage was a disaster. He beat her. She left him. He grew fat and ill and bitter. The beautiful prince who had danced at Holyrood Palace in 1745 became an old man in a Roman palazzo, drinking himself to death, raging against a world that had refused to give him what he believed was his by right. He died in Rome in 1788, at the age of 67, and the Stuart claim died with him because his brother, Henry, Cardinal York, was a Catholic priest who would never marry and who would never produce an heir. George II outlived the Jacobite threat, outlived his wife, outlived most of his contemporaries. He died on the 25th of October 1760, alone in his water closet at Kensington Palace. He had risen early, as he always did. He had drunk his chocolate, as he always did. He had gone to the water closet. His valet, waiting outside, heard a crash. He opened the door and found the king on the floor, fallen from the seat, a blood vessel in his heart having burst. He was 76 years old. He had been king for 33 years. His eldest son, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, had died 9 years earlier. The relationship between George II and Frederick had been terrible, continuing the Hanoverian tradition of fathers and sons who despised each other. George called Frederick a monster and the greatest villain that ever was born. Frederick called his father an obstinate old fool. They maintained rival courts. They competed for the loyalty of politicians. They conducted their hostility in public, each one trying to humiliate the other, a family drama played out on the national stage with the kingdom as the audience. Frederick had died 9 years earlier, struck by a cricket ball that caused an abscess that killed him. The cricket ball hit him in the chest during a game at Cliveden House. The blow seemed minor at the time. Frederick continued playing, but the impact created an internal injury, an abscess that developed over the following weeks, growing larger, becoming infected. The infection spread. The surgeons could do nothing. Frederick died on the 20th of March 1751, at the age of 44, leaving behind 9 children, a grieving wife, and a satirical epitaph that circulated through London within hours of his death. Here lies poor Fred, who was alive and dead. The epitaph was cruel. The death was absurd, and the absurdity had constitutional consequences, because Frederick's death meant that the crown would skip a generation. The crown passed to a grandson, George William Frederick, who was 22 years old, and who had been raised by his mother, Princess Augusta, to believe that he must be a different kind of king, a moral king, an English king, a king who did not keep mistresses and did not speak German and did not govern from a distance, a king who would be loved. George III was the first of his line to be born in England. He was the first to speak English as his first language. He was the first to consider himself British rather than German. And he was the first to be genuinely, deeply, almost stubbornly determined to be a good king. The determination made the disasters that followed feel less like failures of leadership and more like the particular cruelty that history reserves for people who try too hard. He was 22 when he inherited the crown. He was earnest, devout, hard-working, and stiff in the way that earnest, devout, hard-working young men are stiff. The stiffness of someone who has prepared thoroughly for a role and who is now performing it with the careful precision of a student taking an examination. He rose early, at 6 or before. He dressed simply, in a plain coat, without the elaborate wigs and embroidered waistcoats that his grandfather had favoured. He ate a light breakfast, bread and butter and tea, at his desk, and he began working immediately. The red boxes arrived from the ministers. Dispatches arrived from the army. The petitions arrived from subjects who believed correctly that the king read every document that was placed before him. He worked through the morning. He worked through the afternoon. He ate simply. Plain food, roast meat, vegetables from the kitchen garden. He drank sparingly. He wore plain clothes, simple coats without embroidery, without the gold lace and the jeweled buttons that his father and grandfather had favoured. The simplicity was deliberate. It was a rebuke to the excess of his predecessors, a visual statement that the king valued substance over display. The statement was genuine. It was also politically useful. A king who dressed plainly was harder to satirize than like a peacock. He took exercise in the gardens at Kew, walking briskly, talking to the gardeners about soil and drainage and the health of the elm trees. He returned to his desk. He worked until supper. He answered his correspondence by hand, in a clear, precise script that his secretaries found easier to read than their own. He was well educated, better educated than either of his predecessors. He spoke English, French, and German. He read Latin. He understood music, painting, and architecture. He founded the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, giving English painters and sculptors an institution that would nurture and promote British art for centuries. He collected books obsessively, accumulating a library of 65,000 volumes that he eventually donated to the nation. The books became the foundation collection of the British Museum Library, which would become the British Library. He attended to the business of government with a conscientiousness that his grandfather and great-grandfather would have found bewildering. They had governed England as a sideline. George III governed it as a vocation. He needed a wife. The search was conducted with the efficiency of a military operation and the romanticism of a livestock auction. The requirements were specific. She must be Protestant. She must be of suitable rank. She must be healthy, which meant capable of bearing children, which was the primary function the role required. She must be compliant, which meant willing to accept the restrictions that the British court would impose on her. She must not be English, because an English bride would bring English family connections and English political entanglements that the king wished to avoid. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz met every requirement. She was 17. She was the daughter of a minor German duke. She was Protestant, healthy, well-educated, and by the accounts of those who met her, plain, not ugly, not beautiful, plain. The plainness was almost an advantage. A beautiful queen attracted attention, admirers, gossip. A plain queen attracted none of these. A plain queen could be relied upon to focus on her duties rather than on the social opportunities that beauty provided. George met Charlotte for the first time on the day of their wedding, the 8th of September 1761. She arrived in England after a crossing so rough that she was seasick for the entire journey. She stepped off the boat at Harwich, was bundled into a coach, driven to London, presented to the king, and married to him that evening at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The entire process from first meeting to wedding ceremony took approximately 6 hours. Charlotte, who had been raised in a small German court where the pace of life was measured and the surprises were few, found herself married to the King of England before she had time to unpack her trunk. She did not speak English well. She spoke French, which was the language of European courts, and German, of home. English she had studied, but not mastered. The wedding service was conducted in English. The vows she spoke were in a language she had been learning for months, and that she would not speak fluently for years. The words she said, the promises she made, the commitment she entered into, were all performed in translation, with the slight delay, the faint uncertainty that translation always produces. The court watched her with the particular attention that courts bring to new arrivals. They assessed her appearance, they assessed her manner, they assessed her dress, which was German and therefore wrong. They assessed her curtsy, which was adequate. They assessed her composure, which was, under the circumstances, remarkable. She had crossed the sea, met a stranger, married him, and entered the most scrutinized household in England, all in the space of a week. She did not cry, she did not falter. She performed the role that had been assigned to her with a steadiness that would become her defining quality. The marriage worked. This is the fact that distinguishes George and Charlotte from every other Georgian royal couple, and it is a fact that deserves emphasis because it was so unusual. They were faithful to each other. George kept no mistresses. Charlotte had no lovers. In a century when royal infidelity was not just common but expected, George and Charlotte maintained a partnership that was domestic, affectionate, and exclusive. They had 15 children. They ate supper together in the evenings. They played music together, Charlotte on the harpsichord and George on the flute. They attended concerts. They patronized Handel's successor, Johann Christian Bach, and they supported the young Mozart when he visited London as a child prodigy in 1764. The 8-year-old Mozart played for them at Buckingham House, and the King and Queen listened with the attention of people who understood music well enough to recognize genius when they heard it. They raised their children together, or as together as the demands of kingship permitted. George was a present father. He played with his younger children. He supervised the education of the elder ones. He worried about them with the specific, anxious, slightly suffocating worry of a parent who wants his children to be better than he is, and who is terrified that they will be worse. They walked in the gardens at Kew, the botanical gardens that George expanded and improved until they became one of the finest collections of plants in the world. The gardens were his passion and Charlotte's refuge. The paths wound through collections of exotic trees and shrubs gathered from every corner of the growing British Empire, each specimen labelled, catalogued, and cared for with the systematic attention that George brought to everything he touched. The children grew up at Kew and at Buckingham House. George had purchased the building in 1762. It was relatively modest. It would eventually become Buckingham Palace. The household was large. 15 children required nurses, tutors, governesses, attendants. The noise was considerable. The expense was significant. But George loved his children with a warmth that his own father and grandfather had been unable or unwilling to display. The Hanoverian tradition of paternal hostility, of fathers who despised their sons and sons who plotted against their fathers, was broken for one generation at least by George III's genuine delight in his family. They lived in many ways like a prosperous country family who happened to occupy a palace. The domesticity was deliberate. George wanted to be different from his predecessors. He wanted to demonstrate that a king could be moral, that a court could be decent, that the monarchy could set an example of domestic virtue rather than aristocratic vice. The demonstration was genuine. It was also political. A moral king was harder to attack than an immoral one. A faithful husband was harder to satirize than a philanderer. The decency was a shield as well as a principle. The loss of America was the defining failure of his reign, and George experienced it as a personal wound. The American colonies had been part of the British Empire for a century and a half. They were, in George's understanding, his subjects, bound to him by the same ties of loyalty and obligation that bound every other subject of the crown. When they began to resist parliamentary taxation in the 1760s, George interpreted the resistance as disobedience. When the resistance escalated into open rebellion in 1775, George interpreted it as treason. He was not entirely wrong. The American Revolution was, from the British perspective, a rebellion by subjects against their sovereign. The legal position was clear. Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. The colonies had the obligation to pay. The fact that the colonies had no representation in Parliament was, in the British view, irrelevant. because many communities in Britain itself had no representation in Parliament and were taxed anyway. The American argument, no taxation without representation, was a principle that the British Constitution did not recognise. The war lasted 8 years. It consumed treasure and men and the attention of a government that had other problems to manage. The war went badly from the beginning. The distances were enormous. The supply lines stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean. The British Army, which was professional and well-trained, was fighting in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that knew the ground, and that was fighting for something more powerful than territory. The Americans were fighting for an idea, and ideas are harder to defeat than armies. France entered the war on the American side in 1778, turning a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Spain joined France. The Netherlands joined Spain. Britain found itself fighting not just 13 colonies, but most of the major powers of Europe, and the strain was too much. The turning point was not a single battle, but an accumulation of failures. Saratoga in 1777, where an entire British army surrendered, was the moment France decided to intervene. The French intervention changed everything. The Royal Navy, which had controlled the Atlantic, now faced the French fleet. The supply lines that had sustained the British Army in America were threatened. The war that had been difficult became impossible. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 was the end. Lord Cornwallis, commanding the British forces in Virginia, was surrounded by American and French troops and forced to capitulate. The news reached London in late November. George received it in his study. He is reported to have said nothing for several minutes. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence. The Empire's most valuable possession was gone. The loss changed George. The man who emerged from the American crisis was harder, more cautious, more distrustful of advice that did not conform to his own instincts. He had trusted his ministers. His ministers had led him into a war that could not be won. He had trusted his generals. His generals had lost. The betrayal, as he understood it, was not by the Americans, but by the system that had failed to prevent the catastrophe. George drafted a letter of abdication. He wrote it out in his careful hand, the hand that had signed every document of his reign. He described the loss. He expressed his shame. He wrote with the careful formality that characterized all his correspondence, the handwriting steady, the sentences properly constructed, the anguish visible only in the content rather than in the form. The letter is one of the most remarkable documents in British constitutional history. A reigning monarch at his desk, writing his own resignation. The pen moving across the paper. The ink drying on words that would have changed the course of the monarchy if they had ever been sent. He proposed to retire to Hanover, to the German electorate that his family still held, and to live there quietly for the rest of his life. He put the letter in a drawer. He did not send it. He stayed. He put the letter in a drawer. He closed the drawer. He went back to his desk. The staying was, in its quiet way, the bravest thing he ever did. The loss of America humiliated him. It humiliated the nation. It proved that the empire was not invincible, that subjects could rebel and win, that the king's authority extended only as far as the king's army could enforce it. But George absorbed the humiliation. He endured it. He continued to govern. He continued to work. He continued to rise at 6 and read his dispatches and answer his letters and walk in his garden and play his flute and be the decent, dull, faithful, hard-working king that the country needed. The crown that had lost America still held Canada, still held India, still held the Caribbean. The empire would grow again. The loss was terrible. It was not terminal. The people loved him. This was the compensation for everything else. George III was the first Hanoverian monarch to be genuinely popular with the common people of England, and the popularity was rooted in the same qualities that made him a poor strategist and a stubborn wartime leader. He was decent. He was honest. He was faithful to his wife. He cared about his subjects in a way that was visible and specific. He walked among them. He talked to farmers about their crops. He knew the price of wheat. He knew the yield per acre of different varieties of barley. He experimented with agricultural techniques on the royal farms at Windsor, trying new methods of drainage and rotation and breeding. He published articles on farming under the pseudonym Ralph Robinson in the Annals of Agriculture. The articles were knowledgeable and detailed, written with the earnest enthusiasm of a man who had found in the soil and the seasons and the patient work of cultivation something that politics could not provide. The farming was not a hobby, it was a refuge. The same quality of mind that made George a painstaking reader of state papers made him a painstaking observer of soil conditions and rainfall patterns. The precision that exhausted his ministers delighted his tenants. He asked cottagers about their families. He visited factories and workshops and asked intelligent questions about the processes he observed. He earned the nickname Farmer George. The nickname was affectionate rather than mocking. The English common people, who had endured 2 generations of kings who were visibly foreign and visibly uninterested in English life, found in George III a monarch who was recognizably one of them, not in rank, not in wealth, but in temperament, in values, in the particular English quality of wanting to do the right thing and being willing to be boring about it. The popularity sustained him through the loss of America. It sustained him through the political crises that followed. It sustained him through the early episodes of his illness, when the public who did not know the details of the king's condition rallied to his defense against the politicians who wanted to replace him with his son. The people loved George because George loved the people, and the love was reciprocal in a way that no previous Hanoverian king had experienced. Charlotte sustained him too. Through the loss of America, through the political turmoil, through the early episodes of illness, Charlotte was the constant. She managed the household. She managed the 15 children. She managed the court, maintaining the standards of decency and domesticity that George had established. She was not a political operator like Caroline of Ansbach. She did not manage ministers or manipulate policy. She managed her husband, which was a different, and in some ways a harder task. She kept him calm, she kept him focused. She kept the domestic machinery running while the political machinery ground on around them. She also watched him deteriorate, and the watching was the hardest part of her life. The first episode came in the autumn of 1788. George began to behave strangely. He talked without stopping, sentences running into sentences, subjects shifting without transition, the words pouring out in a stream that the people around him found alarming and that he could not control. He became agitated. He walked the corridors at night, talking to the walls. He addressed the furniture as though it were Parliament. He became aggressive. He seized the Prince of Wales at dinner and attempted to throw him against a wall. The court was terrified. The doctors were summoned. The doctors had no idea what was wrong. The medical science of the late 18th century had no category for what George was experiencing. Modern historians and physicians have debated the diagnosis for decades. The most widely discussed theory is porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause episodes of delirium, pain, and psychological disturbance. The theory was proposed in the 1960s and has been both supported and challenged by subsequent research. Other theories include bipolar disorder, lead poisoning from the medications he was given, and various forms of organic brain disease. The truth is that we do not know. The symptoms described in the contemporary accounts are consistent with several diagnoses. The accounts themselves are unreliable. The doctors who wrote them did not understand what they were observing. The political pressures surrounding the king's illness distorted the reporting. They diagnosed various things: fever, delirium, nervous exhaustion. They prescribed various treatments: cold baths, blistering of the skin with heated cups, emetics to induce vomiting. The treatments were brutal and useless. They did not help the king, and they may have made him worse. The most famous of the doctors was Francis Willis, a clergyman who ran a private asylum in Lincolnshire and who was brought to Kew to treat the king. Willis's method was restraint, both physical and psychological. He believed that madness was a failure of self-control, and that the cure for was the imposition of control from outside. The king must be made to obey. The king must be taught that his behavior had consequences. The king must understand that Willis was in charge and that resistance would be met with force. The treatment was conducted with a brutality that is difficult to read about even now. When the king became agitated, Willis had him strapped into a chair. The chair was a heavy wooden device with leather restraints for the arms and legs. The king would be placed in the chair, and the straps would be tightened until he could not move. He would sit there for hours, sometimes for an entire day, unable to stand, unable to shift his position, unable to relieve the cramps that developed in his muscles. The chair was called the restraining chair. When the king refused to cooperate, Willis had him placed in a straitjacket. When the king's speech became incoherent, Willis gagged him. The treatment was conducted in rooms that Charlotte could not enter, but from which she could hear her husband screaming. She sat in the next room. She listened. She could not help. The helplessness was the particular torture that the king's illness inflicted on his wife. The episode lasted several months. George recovered in February 1789. The recovery was celebrated as a miracle. Thanksgiving services were held across the country. The people who had feared for their king's sanity celebrated his return with a joy that was genuine and that was also, underneath the joy, anxious. Because the question that the recovery raised was the question that no one wanted to ask. Would it happen again? It happened again. In 1801. And again in 1804. Each episode lasted longer. Each recovery was less complete. The pattern was established. The king's mind was failing, gradually, episodically, with intervals of lucidity that became shorter and less frequent as the years passed. The Regency crisis of 1788 was the first time the question of the Prince of Wales's authority was raised, and the question was not academic. If the king was incapacitated, someone had to govern. The Constitution had no provision for this. There was no mechanism for transferring power from an incapacitated monarch to a regent. The question had to be resolved by Parliament, and Parliament was divided. William Pitt, the Prime Minister, wanted a limited regency. The regent would have restricted powers. He would not be able to create peers, dissolve Parliament, or make major policy decisions without the approval of a council. Pitt's position was designed to protect the government from the prince, who was a Whig supporter, and who would, if given full royal authority, dismiss Pitt and install a Whig ministry. Charles James Fox, the leader of the opposition, wanted a full regency. The prince should have all the powers of the king. The argument was constitutional. The prince was the heir. The heir should have the full authority of the crown. The debate lasted months. The pamphlets flew. The speeches were made. And then George recovered, and the crisis evaporated, and everyone went back to their positions as though nothing had happened. But the pattern was set. The next time the king lost his mind, the same crisis would recur. And the next time, the king would not recover. The Prince of Wales was waiting. George Augustus Frederick, the eldest son of George III, was the most complicated and the most wasteful member of the Hanoverian dynasty, which is a competitive field. He was handsome in his youth, charming when he chose to be witty, cultivated, a genuine patron of the arts. He was also selfish, extravagant, dishonest, cruel to the women who loved him, and entirely incapable of the self-discipline that his father considered the foundation of kingship. He began spending money before he had any to spend. His debts mounted through his 20s. The spending was not merely excessive, it was compulsive. He could not pass a shop without buying something. He could not see a beautiful object without wanting to own it. He could not attend a horse sale without bidding. He could not commission a coat without commissioning 12. The tailors, the jewelers, the wine merchants, the furniture makers, the horse dealers, the architects. All of them extended credit, because the prince was the prince. Refusing credit to the heir to the throne was not a commercially viable option. The debts accumulated. By the time he was 30, he owed several £100,000, a sum that was incomprehensible to most of his father's subjects, and that the prince himself seemed to regard as a minor administrative inconvenience. He spent on clothes, he spent on horses, he spent on architecture, he spent on food. The meals he consumed were legendary even by the standards of an age that considered excess a form of entertainment. A typical dinner might include 2 soups, 2 kinds of fish, a haunch of venison, a saddle of mutton, cutlets, a whole turkey, a ham, a raised pie, and half a dozen side dishes, followed by pastries, ices, fruit, and cheese. He ate with the systematic concentration of a man who approached food as other men approached warfare, thoroughly, strategically, and with no intention of leaving anything on the field. His weight, which had been manageable in his 20s, climbed steadily through his 30s and 40s, until by his 50s he was so large that his valets had difficulty dressing him, and his tailors had difficulty measuring him. He wore corsets. He wore them without irony, the son of the moral king lacing himself into the same garment that women wore, to achieve the silhouette that fashion demanded. His corsets were specially made, reinforced with whalebone and steel, designed to compress a waist that was by the end more than 50 inches around, consumed at dinners that lasted hours, and that featured courses so numerous that the footmen who served them lost count. The prince grew larger. His tailors grew busier. His creditors grew more desperate. He secretly married Maria Fitzherbert in 1785. She was the love of his life. This is important because the prince had many women and claimed to love all of them. But Fitzherbert was different. She was 6 years older than him. She was a Catholic. She was twice widowed. She was respectable in a way that the prince's other women were not, and her respectability was part of her attraction. She refused to become his mistress. She insisted on marriage. The prince, who was accustomed to getting what he wanted without conditions, found the condition irresistible. He married her in her drawing room on the evening of the 15th of December 1785. The ceremony was performed by a Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Robert Burt, who had been in the Fleet prison for debt, and who was promised that his debts would be paid in exchange for performing the ceremony. 2 witnesses were present. The ring was borrowed. The bride wore a plain dress. The whole proceeding had the furtive quality of something that everyone involved knew was wrong, and that everyone involved was doing anyway. The marriage lasted, in its way, for the rest of the prince's life. He left Fitzherbert repeatedly. He returned to her repeatedly. He married Caroline of Brunswick while still, in his own understanding, married to Fitzherbert. He denied the marriage in Parliament while writing Fitzherbert letters that addressed her as his wife. The inconsistency did not trouble him. Consistency was not among his talents. Fitzherbert outlived him. She died in 1837, 7 years after the prince, at the age of 81. She was buried in Brighton, in the Catholic Church of St. John the Baptist, wearing 3 wedding rings. One was from her first husband. One was from the prince. She wore all 3 to the grave, a woman who had been married 3 times and who had been, in the eyes of the law, legally married to none of them, when the man she loved most was alive. He denied the marriage in Parliament. He authorised his friend Charles James Fox to stand in the House of Commons and declare that no marriage had taken place. Fox did so. The declaration was a lie. Fox discovered it was a lie and was furious. Mrs. Fitzherbert discovered the denial and was heartbroken. The prince managed to betray everyone involved in the transaction while maintaining his own position, a skill he would refine over the next 40 years. In 1795, Parliament offered the prince a deal. It would pay his debts, which had reached £600,000, if he would marry a suitable Protestant bride and produce a legitimate heir. The prince agreed. The bride selected was his first cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, a German princess he had never met. The selection was made by the prince's father, and the selection was either a miscalculation or a punishment, because Caroline of Brunswick was, by the universal testimony of everyone who met her, a disaster. She was loud. She was coarse. She told inappropriate jokes at dinner. She discussed bodily functions with a frankness that the English found genuinely shocking. She flirted with every man she met, not because she was attracted to them, but because flirtation was the social currency she had been raised with, and she did not understand that the English played by different rules. She had opinions, and she expressed them. She had appetites, and she did not conceal them. She did not wash with the frequency that English court etiquette required. She spoke her mind with a directness that was considered charming in Brunswick and appalling in London. She was not beautiful, though she was not ugly either. She was simply wrong, wrong for the court, wrong for the prince, wrong for the role, wrong in every particular that could be assessed in advance, and in several that could not. The prince met Caroline for the first time 3 days before the wedding. The meeting took place at St. James's Palace. Caroline curtsied. The prince looked at her, turned to his equerry, Lord Malmesbury, and said, "I am not well. Pray, get me a glass of brandy." He then left the room. He did not return for several hours. The wedding took place on the 8th of April 1795 at the Chapel Royal. The prince was drunk. He had been drinking all day, and by the time the ceremony began he was barely able to stand. He swayed at the altar. He looked around the chapel as though searching for an exit. The Archbishop of Canterbury paused during the service, at the point where objections are invited, and looked meaningfully at the prince and then at the king, who looked at the floor. No objection was raised. The ceremony continued. The marriage was sealed. The wedding night was, by Caroline's later account, brief and unpleasant. The prince spent most of it on the floor in front of the fireplace, where he had fallen after drinking. He roused himself enough to perform the act that the succession required. They conceived a daughter that night, or very shortly afterward. The daughter, Princess Charlotte, would be born on the 7th of January 1796. She would be the prince's only legitimate child. She would be raised by governesses in a household separate from both her parents, because neither parent could be trusted with her care. Her father ignored her. Her mother, who loved her with the desperate intensity of a woman who had nothing else, was permitted to see her only at regulated intervals. Charlotte grew up knowing that she was the hope of the dynasty, the only legitimate grandchild of George III, the person on whom the entire future of the monarchy depended. The knowledge was a burden that she carried from childhood. She would be the hope of the dynasty, and she would die in childbirth at the age of 21, an event that would trigger the succession crisis that eventually produced Queen Victoria. After Charlotte's conception, the prince and Caroline separated. The separation was not formal. There was no ecclesiastical proceeding, no parliamentary petition. The prince simply stopped seeing his wife. He returned to Mrs. Fitzherbert. He returned to his debts. He returned to the life that the marriage had briefly interrupted and done nothing to change. Caroline was given a separate household and a generous allowance, and the freedom to live as she chose, which she did, with an enthusiasm that provided the prince with ammunition he would later use against her. The final descent into permanent madness was gradual. Through 1810, the king's episodes became more frequent and the lucid intervals shorter. By the autumn, the physicians were unanimous. The king would not recover. Straw was laid in the courtyard outside the king's apartments to muffle the sound of the carriages and the horses. The household moved quietly. The servants spoke in whispers. The doctors came and went through a side entrance so that their visits would not be observed by the public. The pretense that the king was merely unwell, that he would recover, that the indisposition was temporary, was maintained for as long as it could be maintained, which was not long. The mind that had governed the country for 50 years, that had managed the loss of America and the threat of revolution and the wars with France, was gone. The body remained. The man remained. But the king, in the sense that mattered, had ceased to exist. In 1811, George III's madness became permanent. The lucid intervals stopped. The king was blind. He was deaf. He wandered the corridors of Windsor Castle in a dressing gown, talking to people who had been dead for decades. He held conversations with Lord North, who had died in 1792. He greeted courtiers who existed only in his memory. The servants who attended him learned to respond to these conversations as though the invisible interlocutors were real, because contradicting the king caused distress, and because the distress served no purpose. The king was beyond correction. The madness was his world now, and the world had its own logic, and the logic could not be argued with. He did not know that the regency had been established. He did not know that his son governed in his name. He did not know that Napoleon had been defeated. He did not know about Waterloo. The greatest military victory in British history was won while the king sat in his room at Windsor, playing the harpsichord, wearing a purple dressing gown. His white hair and white beard gave him the appearance of a biblical patriarch who had wandered out of the Old Testament and into a castle he no longer recognized. He played the harpsichord for hours, the same tunes repeated over and over. The music drifted through the empty rooms of the castle. The servants moved quietly. The doctors observed. The Queen sat in her apartments and listened. The Regency Act was passed on the 5th of February 1811. The Prince of Wales became regent with full royal authority. The Prince Regent's court was the most glamorous in Europe, and the glamour was intentional. George wanted to rival Napoleon, not on the battlefield, where he would never set foot, but in the drawing room where his talents actually lay. He wanted London to be the social capital of the world. He wanted Carlton House to outshine Versailles. He wanted the English aristocracy, which he considered dowdy and provincial, to dress and eat and entertain at a level that would impress the most sophisticated visitors from Paris and Vienna. The Prince Regent celebrated his new authority with a dinner, a magnificent dinner. A dinner for 2,000 guests at Carlton House, served at tables that stretched through every room of the building and out into the gardens. The centerpiece of the main table was a stream of real water flowing through a silver channel, with live fish swimming in it. Goldfish and silverfish gliding past the guests as they ate their way through course after course. The dinner cost by one estimate more than £120,000. The country was at war. The soldiers who were fighting that war were eating salt beef and hard biscuit in the mud of Spain. The contrast was not lost on the satirists. The era that bears his name, the Regency, the period that defines the world of Austen and of Bridgerton and of the great country houses and the London season, officially began. It was presided over by a man who was 51 years old, enormously fat, and entirely devoted to pleasure. The Regency lasted 9 years, from 1811 to 1820, but the cultural period that bears the name extends further in both directions. From roughly 1795 to 1837, it embraces the late Georgian and the early Victorian in a single aesthetic characterized by lightness, proportion, and restraint. The furniture is clean-lined, the silverware is elegant, the houses are symmetrical, the clothes are draped rather than structured. The colors are pale. The effect is one of deliberate simplicity that conceals enormous expense. The paradox of a style that looks effortless and that costs a fortune to achieve. That the Regency as a cultural period is defined by its elegance. The architecture, the furniture, the fashion, the social rituals, all of these have a quality of refinement and restraint that seems at odds with the man who gave the period its name. The Prince Regent was not refined. He was not restrained. He was excessive in everything. He ate enormously. He drank copiously. He spent lavishly. He built the Brighton Pavilion. The building defies description, though not for lack of people trying. It is a palace designed to look like a Mughal fantasy. Onion domes, minarets, chinoiserie, a kitchen that could roast an entire ox. A banqueting room where a dragon chandelier hung from the ceiling above a table set for 36 guests. The interior was decorated in a style that combined Chinese, Indian, and Gothic influences in a manner that no Asian or European designer would have recognized as authentic. The colours were vivid, the gilding was lavish, the effect was overwhelming. It was, depending on your taste, either the most imaginative building in England or the most vulgar, a building so extravagant and so bizarre that even the prince's friends found it difficult to defend. He redecorated Carlton House, his London residence, so many times and at such expense that the building became a symbol of everything the public hated about him. The renovations were constant: new wallpaper, new curtains, new furniture, new fittings. Each renovation cost thousands of pounds. Each renovation was followed within months by another renovation, because the prince's taste evolved faster than the craftsman could work. What was perfect in January was obsolete by March. The dining room that had been redecorated in Chinese style was redecorated in Gothic French Empire style, each transformation erasing the last, each transformation costing more than the last. Eventually, he demolished Carlton House entirely. He decided it was not grand enough. The site was cleared, and the materials were salvaged, and some of them were used in the construction of Buckingham Palace, which Nash was commissioned to rebuild from the modest house that George III had purchased. The rebuilding was never finished in George IV's lifetime. The costs spiraled. Parliament protested. Nash was dismissed. The building was completed, after a fashion, by William IV, who moved in reluctantly and who found the place uncomfortable. The whole episode, the building and the demolishing and the rebuilding, cost the nation more than £1 million. The money came from Parliament. Parliament's money came from taxes. The taxes came from the working people of England, who paid for a palace they would never enter, built by a king they would never meet, for purposes they would never understand. But the things he bought were beautiful. This is the complication. The Prince Regent had taste. His taste was expensive, and his methods of financing it were unconscionable, but the taste itself was genuine. The furniture he commissioned from the finest craftsmen in England is still considered among the best ever produced. The silver and the porcelain he collected are museum pieces. The Brighton Pavilion, for all its absurdity, is a work of architectural imagination that has no equivalent in England. Carlton House, before he demolished it to build something even grander, was considered the finest private residence in London. The Prince Regent was a patron in the truest sense. He supported architects, craftsmen, artists, musicians. He gave John Nash the commissions that produced Regent's Park and Regent Street. John Nash was the Prince's architect, his collaborator, his co-conspirator in the transformation of London. Nash was not the most talented architect of his generation. He was the most ambitious. He shared the Prince's appetite for scale, for grandeur, for projects that would change the shape of a city rather than merely adding a building to it. The partnership between the Prince and Nash produced more lasting change to London's geography than any other collaboration between a patron and an architect in the city's history. The vision was enormous. A processional route from Carlton House in the south to a new park in the north, lined with stuccoed terraces and punctuated by crescents and circles, a boulevard that would rival anything in Paris or Vienna. Nash delivered. The terraces of Regent's Park, with their white facades and their classical columns, are still among the most beautiful urban compositions in Europe. Regent Street, curving from Piccadilly to Portland Place, reshaped the commercial geography of London. He was, in the things he bought and the buildings he commissioned, a king of genuine cultural significance. The Prince Regent's name is written across the map of the city in letters of Portland stone. Walk down Regent Street today, past the curved facades and the stuccoed terraces, and you are walking through a landscape that was imagined by a man who never walked it himself. The Prince Regent rode in carriages. He did not walk. But the street that bears his name was designed for walking, for promenading, for the particular English pleasure of seeing and being seen. The street is his monument. It is a better monument than he deserves, and it will outlast every memory of the man who commissioned it. He was also, in the way he treated people, a king of genuine cruelty. He abandoned Mrs. Fitzherbert repeatedly. He tried to destroy Caroline. He ignored his daughter Charlotte. This was perhaps the cruelest of his many cruelties, because Charlotte was a child who wanted nothing more than her father's attention, and whose father could not be bothered to provide it. She saw him occasionally, at formal audiences that were arranged by the court and that had the atmosphere of diplomatic meetings rather than family visits. She was brought into his presence. She curtsied. He asked her a question or two about her studies, she answered. He dismissed her. The entire encounter might last 10 minutes. Charlotte grew up lonely and rebellious and determined, in the way that children of neglectful parents often do, to be nothing like the person who had failed her. She broke off her engagement to the Prince of Orange because she did not love him, and because she had decided that she would not be traded like a commodity the way her mother had been. She married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in 1816 for love. The marriage was happy. The happiness lasted 18 months. Then she died in childbirth on the 5th of November 1817, along with her stillborn son. The dynasty that her father had not bothered to secure was left without an heir. The Prince Regent received the news of his daughter's death at Carlton House. He collapsed. The grief was real. The grief was also, for a man who had ignored his daughter for most of her life, too late. He had failed her when she was alive. His tears when she was dead were the tears of a man who understood finally what he had wasted. He cut old friends when they became inconvenient. He lied about matters large and small, with a fluency that suggested he could no longer distinguish between truth and invention. He was charming, and he was vicious, and the people who knew him could never be certain which quality they were encountering at any given moment. Charlotte died on the 20th of November 1818, at the age of 73. She had spent the final years of her life in increasing isolation, managing the household at Windsor, while her husband sat in his rooms talking to ghosts and her son ran the country from Carlton House. The Regency had transferred the power from the king to the regent, and the transfer had also transferred Charlotte's relevance. She was the queen, but the queen of an incapacitated king, and the distinction between queen consort and dowager-in-waiting was one that the court understood, even if the title did not reflect it. She had been George's partner for 57 years. She had borne 15 children. She had managed the court, the household, the family, the public face of the monarchy. Through a reign that included the loss of America, the madness of the king, the Regency crisis, the Napoleonic Wars, and the slow, terrible decline of the man she had married on a September evening in 1761, when she was 17 and seasick and had never seen his face. She died at Kew, in the Dutch House, a modest building by royal standards, on the 17th of November 1818. Her children were around her. The Prince Regent was present, kneeling by the bed. The Duke of York was there. Princess Mary was there. The Archbishop of Canterbury read prayers. Charlotte was conscious to the end. She held the regent's hand. She had spent 57 years managing this man and his siblings and his father and the court and the household and the nation's expectations. In the final hours, the management was over. There was only the hand and the holding and the quiet. George III did not know she was dead. He was at Windsor, in his rooms, playing the harpsichord. No one told him. There was no point. He would not have understood. The woman who had been his partner, his companion, his anchor, the one person in his life who had never wavered, was gone. The king played on in his empty rooms. The music continued. The silence beneath the music was the silence of a man who was already, in every sense that mattered, alone. George III died on the 29th of January 1820 at Windsor Castle, at 8:30 in the evening. He was 81 years old. He had been king for 59 years. He had been blind for a decade. He had been deaf for nearly as long. He had been mad in the clinical sense for at least 9 years. And in the broader sense, in the sense of being detached from the world that was governed in his name, for much longer, his death was quiet. A servant noticed that the king's breathing had changed. A doctor was called. The breathing slowed. It stopped. The man who had lost America, who had tried to abdicate, who had loved his wife and his farm and his people with a sincerity that none of his predecessors had managed, was dead. The Prince Regent, who had been governing in his father's name for 9 years, became George IV, King of Great Britain and Ireland. Dantamikmun, George IV's reign lasted 10 years and accomplished almost nothing. This is not entirely his fault. The political system had evolved to the point where the king's personal involvement in government was largely ceremonial, and the ceremony was the part of kingship that George performed best. He looked magnificent. He dressed magnificently. He entertained magnificently. He opened Parliament with a speech that someone else had written and that he delivered with the assurance of a man who has spent his life performing. The performance was the reign. The one event that defined his time as king was his attempt to divorce Caroline. He had been trying to get rid of her for years. When he became king, Caroline announced her intention to return to England and claim her position as queen. George was horrified. He instructed his government to introduce a Bill of Pains and Penalties in the House of Lords, a legislative proceeding that would strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery. The trial, because that is what the proceeding amounted to, was the most sensational public event of 1820. Witnesses were brought from Italy, where Caroline had been living since 1814. They had been tracked down, recruited, and in some cases bribed by agents of the government who had spent months collecting evidence against the Queen. The witnesses were Italian servants, boatmen, hoteliers, people who had observed Caroline's life on the continent. They were now being asked to describe it in a language most of them did not speak, through interpreters in a chamber they found intimidating. The testimony was intimate. The witnesses described Caroline's relationship with Bartolomeo Pagani, her Italian courier. Servants described her relationship with an Italian courier named Bartolomeo Pagani. The details were intimate, graphic, and consumed by the public with an appetite that the earlier criminal conversation trials had not prepared anyone for. The newspapers printed every word. The caricaturists produced prints that sold in thousands. The public reaction was extraordinary. Caroline became, overnight, a symbol of everything the people hated about the king. She was wronged. She was persecuted. She was a woman being destroyed by a man who had treated her abominably and who was now using the machinery of the state to finish the job. The crowds gathered outside Parliament. They cheered when Caroline arrived in her carriage. They booed the witnesses against her. They threw stones at the carriages of the lords who voted to continue the proceedings. The army was called out to maintain order. The public, which had no great love for Caroline, but which had a profound dislike of the king, took Caroline's side. The bill was withdrawn. The government could not sustain it against public opinion. Caroline appeared at the coronation in July 1821, demanding entry to Westminster Abbey. The doors were locked against her. She banged on the doors. The guards refused to open them. The crowd, which had gathered to watch the coronation procession and which had been cheering Caroline for months, watched as the Queen of England was physically prevented from entering her own husband's coronation. The scene was extraordinary. A queen in her robes pounding on the doors of Westminster Abbey, the guards standing firm, the crowd murmuring, the king inside, being anointed, being crowned, being celebrated, while his wife stood outside in the street like a woman refused admission to a party she had not been invited to. She was turned away. She went home. The humiliation of being turned away from her own husband's coronation, of standing in the street while the doors of the abbey were closed against her, was the final injury. She had survived the trial. But the closed doors of Westminster Abbey were something she could not survive. The symbolism was too complete. She was the queen, and she was locked out of her own coronation, and the crowd that had cheered her for months could do nothing but watch. She fell ill. She died on the 7th of August 1821, 3 weeks after the coronation, of what was diagnosed as a bowel obstruction. but what may have been something else entirely. The rumors of poisoning were never substantiated. The timing was suspicious. The king did not mourn. He spent his final years at Windsor, growing larger, growing slower, growing more dependent on laudanum, the tincture of opium that he took for the pain in his swollen legs, and that he took in increasing quantities as the pain increased. He saw almost no one. His daily routine had contracted to the dimensions of an invalid's existence. He rose late. He ate breakfast in bed. He received his physician, who examined the swollen legs and prescribed more laudanum, and shook his head privately at the attendants outside the door. He sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the long walk, the avenue of elms that stretched south from the castle toward the great park. He could see the trees. The view was magnificent. It was the view of a man who owned everything he could see and who could enjoy none of it. He could not walk among them. The laudanum dulled the pain, but it did not restore the movement. His legs would not carry him. The ankles were swollen to twice their normal size. The skin was stretched and discolored. The physicians bandaged them. The bandages did not help. The body that had danced at 100 balls, that had ridden to hounds at Brighton, that had walked the streets of London in the most fashionable clothes in England, was now a prison of flesh and fluid that held him in his chair. He lived in his private apartments, surrounded by the beautiful objects he had spent his life accumulating, the paintings, the furniture, the porcelain, the silver. The things he had bought were the most lasting achievement of his life. The paintings he collected, Dutch masters, Flemish masters, Italian Renaissance works, formed the core of what would become the Royal Collection, one of the finest art collections in the world. The furniture he commissioned from the workshops of Morel and Seddon is still in use at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. The silver and the porcelain are displayed in the staterooms that millions of tourists visit each year. The man who was despised in life left behind objects that are treasured in death. The objects are his truest memorial, more lasting than any monument, more eloquent than any epitaph, and they surrounded him at the end like the furnishings of a tomb. He died on the 26th of June 1830 at 3 a.m. at Windsor Castle. He was 67 years old. His body was so swollen that the coffin had to be specially constructed to accommodate it. The funeral was not well attended. The mourning was perfunctory. The court observed the forms. The country did not grieve. The Times published an obituary that has become famous for its savagery. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? The words were harsh. They were also, by the general consensus of history, accurate. His brother William succeeded him. William IV was a former naval officer who had spent most of his life at sea and who approached kingship with the bluff, unpretentious manner of a man who would rather be on a quarterdeck than on a throne. He was mildly eccentric. He made long, rambling speeches at public dinners. He walked the streets of London without a guard, shaking hands with anyone who approached him, a habit that alarmed his ministers and delighted his subjects. He was, in almost every respect, the opposite of his brother George, and the contrast was a relief. After a decade of excess and scandal and the bloated magnificence of George IV, the country welcomed a king who was ordinary. William wore plain clothes. He spoke plainly. He had no mistresses, no architectural ambitions, and no debts that required parliamentary intervention. He was exactly what the country needed after George IV, which was someone who was not George IV. He reigned for 7 years. He passed the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded the franchise and redistributed parliamentary seats, the first significant reform of a political system that had not changed since the 17th century. He did not pass it willingly. He was pressured by his ministers, by public opinion, and by the threat of revolution, but he passed it, and the passing was the most important political event of the decade, and it was achieved by the most forgettable king of the century, which is perhaps the most Georgian thing of all. The kings did not matter. The system mattered. And the system worked best when the kings got out of its way. He produced no legitimate surviving children. When he died on the 20th of June 1837, the crown passed to his niece, Alexandrina Victoria. She was 18 years old. She was woken at 6 in the morning by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain. They knelt before her in her dressing gown and informed her that she was queen. The morning she received the news, Victoria wrote in her journal. She described the visit of the Archbishop. She described her feelings. She wrote with the clarity and the composure of a woman who understood that the moment was historic and who intended to record it properly. She was 18. She was small. She was determined. And she was, from the moment the Archbishop knelt before her, the most powerful woman in the world. And the Georgian era was over. 116 years of George. 4 kings, one name, stretched across 5 generations of a family that had arrived from Germany with 2 mistresses and a retinue of courtiers, and that had, in the course of a century, become as English as the country they governed. The question deserves a careful answer, because the easy answer, nothing, is wrong, and the generous answer, everything, is also wrong. The truth is, somewhere in the middle, in the complicated space where accident and intention overlap. The first George gave England the system of cabinet government that still operates today. He gave it not by design, but by absence. His inability to follow English politics created the space that the Prime Minister filled, and the filling became permanent. The second George gave England its last warrior king and its definitive defeat of the Jacobite cause. After Culloden, the Stuart claim was finished. The Hanoverian succession was secure. The question of who ruled England was settled, and the settlement endured. The third George gave England its most human king and its most painful lesson. The loss of America taught the empire that colonies could not be held by force against the will of their people, a lesson that the empire would spend the next 2 centuries learning and forgetting and learning again. And his madness taught the Constitution that the monarchy needed a mechanism for continuity when the monarch could not function. The Regency Act of 1811 was the first formal acknowledgement that the king was not indispensable. The fourth George gave England its most beautiful buildings and its most cautionary example of what happens when a man of taste and no discipline is given unlimited resources. He was the worst of the 4 and the most entertaining. He was the one the satirists loved. He was the one the people despised. He was the one who proved, conclusively, that a king could be cultured and worthless at the same time. Between them, the 4 Georges presided over the transformation of England from a provincial European kingdom into a global empire. They did not cause the transformation. They did not lead it. They did not understand it. They merely occupied the throne while it happened around them, while the politicians and the merchants and the soldiers and the inventors and the ordinary people of England built something extraordinary in the spaces that their kings left empty. The Georgian squares of London, the iron railings, the plane trees, the uniform facades of brown brick, each house identical to its neighbour, the symmetry expressing the Georgian belief that order and proportion were the foundations of beauty, the crescents of Bath. John Wood the Elder and John Wood the Younger built a city in pale stone that curves along the hillside like a Roman amphitheatre turned inside out, the columns and the pediments and the carved friezes creating a vision of classical order that the Romans themselves would have recognized, the furniture and the silver and the porcelain. The Chippendale chairs and the Hepplewhite sideboards and the Wedgwood dinner services, the Adam fireplaces with their delicate plasterwork, the Sheraton writing desks with their hidden drawers and their inlaid woods, the objects that the Georgians made and bought and lived with, objects that were designed to be beautiful and functional at the same time, objects that expressed the Georgian conviction that elegance and utility were not opposites but partners. The language of architecture and design that we still call Georgian, the music of Handel, the novels of Fielding, the paintings of Gainsborough and Reynolds, the gardens of Capability Brown, these are the things the era produced. They were produced not by kings, but by the culture that grew up around them, a culture of elegance and brutality and ambition and restraint that defined a century. It echoes still in the streets and the buildings and the institutions that the four Georges left behind. If you have been listening tonight to the story of the four kings who gave their name to an era, I hope you have heard something behind the crowns and the carriages and the coronations. Four men, each one different from the last, each one shaped by his father's failures and determined to avoid them, each one failing in his own particular way. The German who could not speak English, the soldier who fought on foot when his horse bolted, the farmer who lost an empire and lost his mind, the glutton who ate and built and spent his way through a decade and left behind nothing but debts and beauty. If you enjoyed spending the evening with the Georges, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. There are more stories to tell, more reigns to follow, more corridors to walk. And if you know someone who loves history, or who has ever wondered what happened inside the palaces when the doors were closed, please share this with them. The candles are low now. The palace is quiet. The last of the Georges is in his coffin, specially built, carried by men who did not love him, to a vault where he will lie beside the others, the four kings, the four Georges, the family that arrived as strangers and departed as ancestors. The crown has passed to a girl of 18. The era has ended. The buildings remain. The music remains. The name remains. Georgian, a word that means a century of kings and everything that grew in spite of them. Good night.